The Trojan Horse, an ancient symbol of cunning and deception that has etched its way into the annals of history, holding both the triumph of strategy and the bitter taste of betrayal. It is a tale that continues to captivate the imagination, not just for the complexity of the trick itself, but for the underlying lessons it imparts about the human condition, about war, trust, and the thin line that separates victory from moral ruin. But what if the Trojan Horse, one of the most legendary events in ancient warfare, was not a tale of honor or valor at all? What if it was a result of a masterstroke of deceit, a calculated move in a game where the stakes were far higher than the simple clash of shields and swords? Imagine a moment when the world's greatest military force, the Greeks, stood at the gates of Troy, their armies weary after 10 years of bitter siege. The city had withstood every assault. Its walls were strong, its defenders fierce. And yet, despite all their might, the Greeks found themselves stuck in a deadlock, unable to break through the impregnable walls of Troy. The story of the Trojan Horse begins here, in this moment of desperation and frustration, a moment when the Greek forces, their resources stretched thin and morale shattered, were forced to look for a solution beyond brute strength. And so, from the depths of their collective ingenuity, a plan was born, not one of direct confrontation, but one of subtlety, cunning, and trickery. It was a plan so bold, so audacious, that it would change the course of history. But it was also a plan laced with moral ambiguity, a plan that would forever question the integrity of those who executed it. The Greeks, led by the wily Odysseus, crafted a towering wooden horse, hollowed out to house their finest warriors. Hidden from view, silent, waiting. The horse was left at the gates of Troy as a supposed gift, a symbol of the Greeks' withdrawal from the war, their acceptance of defeat. Alongside it was a false offering, a message from the Greeks that they had abandoned the siege, believing that Troy had finally defeated them. For the Trojans, already weary from years of conflict, the sight of the horse seemed like a beacon of peace. The Greeks, they thought, had surrendered. The horse, a seemingly harmless token of their withdrawal, was brought inside the city walls as a symbol of victory, of the fall of their enemies. But within the hollow structure of the horse, Greek soldiers lay in wait, their fate bound to the quiet, deceptive nature of the ruse. It is a story that plays out like a slow, tense crescendo. The Trojans, unaware of the lurking danger, celebrated their victory. They held feasts and sang songs of triumph, oblivious of the fact that the true danger was already inside their walls. They had been lulled into a false sense of security by the very symbol that was meant to mark their success, the Trojan horse. The horse, which they believed was a gift, a mark of their superiority over the Greeks, was in reality the tool of their ultimate downfall. It was the moment of triumph, the peak of their perceived victory, that sealed their doom. The soldiers inside the horse waited in silence, knowing that at any moment, the moment of truth would arrive. They could hear the sounds of celebration from within the city, and with each passing hour, the weight of their mission grew heavier. They had been chosen not only for their skill as warriors, but for their ability to remain still, to act without hesitation, to hold back their breath as they waited for the right moment. It was a moment that would come when the city was lulled into a deep, drunken sleep, when the last remnants of their guards were too tired to stand watch, and when the Trojans, in their revelry, were blind to the forces working silently against them. As night fell over the city, the Greek soldiers slowly emerged from the horse, creeping into the streets of Troy with practiced silence. The gates were open, and the rest of the Greek army, who had seemingly retreated, returned in force. They had been lying in wait on the nearby island, just out of sight, and now they poured into the city in a swift, coordinated attack. The Trojans, caught off guard and unprepared for such a betrayal, were thrown into chaos. The city, which had been filled with pride and celebration just hours before, was now consumed by panic and confusion. The once mighty walls of Troy, which had stood firm for so long, were now nothing more than obstacles in the path of the Greeks' ruthless advance. In a matter of hours, Troy, the jewel of the ancient world, was brought to its knees. The city that had stood for centuries, with its legendary walls and its brave defenders, was reduced to rubble. The Trojans, who had once been so sure of their victory, now found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The Greeks had won, not through strength, but through deception. They had played on the pride, the arrogance, and the vulnerability of the Trojans, exploiting their weaknesses in ways that will be felt for generations to come. But what makes the story of the Trojan Horse so compelling is not just the brilliance of the plan, nor even the sheer audacity of the Greeks in pulling it off. What makes this story endure through the ages is the moral complexity it presents. The Greeks, in their pursuit of victory, resorted to an act of deception. They tricked their enemies, manipulated their sense of security, and used trust as a weapon. And in doing so, they achieved what they could not through force alone. But at what cost? The Trojan Horse, for all its brilliance, is also a symbol of moral ambiguity. Was the victory truly worth the means by which it was achieved? Was it a triumph of intellect and strategy? Or was it the victory of dishonesty over honor? The story of the Trojan Horse raises difficult questions about the nature of war, deception, and victory. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes, in order to win, we must sacrifice our own integrity. It reminds us that, in war, the ends do not always justify the means. And yet, for all the questions it raises, the story also teaches us something about the human spirit, the lengths to which people will go in order to survive, to conquer, to endure. The Trojan Horse was not just a story of military strategy. It was a story of survival, of cunning, and of the will to win at all costs. As we explore the events that led to the creation of the Trojan Horse, we find ourselves faced with a tension between honor and deception, between the desire for glory and the harsh realities of war. It is a tension that still exists today, in both large and small ways. The Trojan Horse is more than just an ancient myth. It is a reflection of the timeless struggles that we face, struggles that revolve around our understanding of truth, trust, and the consequences of our actions. It is a story that continues to resonate, not just because of the dramatic nature of the events, but because of the fundamental questions it raises about who we are as humans and what we are willing to sacrifice in pursuit of victory. The legacy of the Trojan Horse endures not only in the history of ancient Greece and Troy, but in our modern world, where deceit, strategy, and cunning still play critical roles in the outcomes of conflicts, both personal and political. The Trojan Horse is a symbol of the complexity of human nature, a story of brilliance tainted by dishonesty, and a reminder that even the most legendary victories come with a price. In the quiet, early days before the roar of battle filled the air, Troy stood as a beacon of prosperity, strength, and invulnerability. The city, with its towering walls, had earned its place in the history books not merely for its architectural grandeur, but for its strategic significance in the ancient world. The Trojans had not risen to such heights without reason. No, they had fought and bled for every stone of their city's defenses. Its towering walls were legends in themselves, said to be built with the help of the gods, impervious to the battering rams, the siege engines, and the firebrands of their enemies. The Trojans were a people proud of their heritage, their place in the world, and their standing as an ancient power. Yet, even in this moment of relative peace, under the seemingly calm skies of the ancient Mediterranean, tension had already begun to brew. A spark had been struck on the distant plains of Mount Ida, setting into motion a chain of events that would turn the world upside down. It all began with a simple judgment, a judgment made by Paris, the young prince of Troy, who found himself caught in the midst of a divine contest of vanity, beauty, and promises. A quarrel between three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, had erupted over who among them was the fairest. Unable to come to a decision, they turned to Paris, a mortal who had been chosen as a judge. Each goddess offered him an irresistible bribe. Hera promised him power, Athena promised him wisdom, and Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, swayed by the promise of love and beauty, awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite. This seemingly trivial decision, a beauty contest between goddesses, would be the spark that ignited the flames of war. For Aphrodite, in granting Paris' prize, directed him to Helen, the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. The moment Paris and Helen laid eyes on each other, a love as fierce and destructive as it was inevitable was born. Helen, torn between loyalty to her husband and the overwhelming pull of Paris' charm, ultimately chose to abandon her home and her marriage to elope with him to Troy. What followed was a betrayal that would ripple across the Aegean and beyond, sending waves of shock through Greece. Menelaus, angered and humiliated, called upon his brother Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, and together they raised an army of warriors, kings, and heroes, all bound by an oath sworn long before. The Greek leaders had vowed to come to the aid of Helen's suitors should she ever be taken by force. And now, the time had come to fulfill that promise. The stage was set for what would become one of the most legendary conflicts in history, the Trojan War. The Greeks, under Agamemnon's leadership, launched their campaign against Troy, and thus began the siege that would last for a decade. The city of Troy, once the jewel of the Aegean, found itself besieged by a powerful force, an alliance of Greek kings and warriors, all eager to claim victory and bring Helen back to Sparta. But Troy, under the command of its king Priam and his valiant son Hector, stood firm. The walls of Troy were unlike any other. Towering and seemingly impenetrable, they held strong against every Greek assault. The Trojans, too, were fierce warriors, their valor only growing with each Greek attack. They were not just fighting for their city, but for their very survival, for their honor and pride. And for 10 long years, they managed to hold their ground. During this long and weary siege, the Greeks could do little more than surround the city, launching waves of attacks, laying siege to the walls and trying and failing to breach the mighty defenses. The Trojans had adapted to the constant onslaught, learning the patterns of the Greek attacks and reinforcing their walls with each passing year. But as the months stretched into years, the Greek forces grew increasingly frustrated, their morale fading, their resources dwindling. The once proud army found itself in a position it had never expected, a stalemate. The idea of breaking through the city's defenses seemed impossible, and the siege, what had once felt like a temporary inconvenience, had become a seemingly endless endeavor. The Greek leaders, exhausted by prolonged battle, began to question their strategy, their leadership, and even the very rationale for the war itself. The situation for the Greeks had become increasingly dire. Every assault they launched against the walls of Troy ended in failure, and the Greeks began to suffer more than just physical exhaustion. The morale of the soldiers sagged under the weight of the unrelenting siege. There was little hope left. They had been stuck at the gates of Troy for years, unable to break through, unable to gain ground. They had seen their comrades fall, and the harsh realities of war began to settle into their bones. The once unified army had begun to splinter. The generals argued, soldiers muttered of mutiny, and frustration began to take root in every corner of the Greek camp. The Trojans, on the other hand, while aware of the pressure mounting on their enemies, had their own problems. Though they had resisted every Greek attempt to breach their walls, they, too, were beginning to feel the strain of the endless siege. It was in this moment of exhaustion, when the Greeks were teetering on the edge of despair, that the seeds of the most daring and infamous plan in history were sown. The Greek leaders, after years of relentless battle, realized that brute force alone would never bring Troy to its knees. They would need to think differently. It was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, known not only for his bravery but for his unparalleled wit and cunning, who first proposed a new strategy. The Greeks, he suggested, would not simply continue to pound against the walls of Troy until they broke. No. Instead, they would turn the very symbol of the Greek defeat into the weapon that would bring Troy down from the inside. Odysseus's mind, always quick and always calculating, envisioned something extraordinary, a trick. Rather than continuing their futile attempts to breach the walls, the Greeks would deceive the Trojans, planting the seed of victory in the minds of their enemies. The Greeks would construct a massive wooden horse, hollowed out to hide their best soldiers. This horse would be presented to the Trojans as a token of peace, a supposed gift honor the gods after the Greeks' departure from the war. It was a plan of both brilliance and risk, and it would depend entirely on the Trojans' willingness to accept the offering and bring it inside their city walls. But the plan, though ingenious, was fraught with danger. The Greeks knew that if they miscalculated, if the Trojans were even the slightest bit suspicious or unwilling to accept the gift, the entire strategy would fail. The Greeks would be left exposed, their soldiers trapped, and the Trojans would surely strike back with devastating force. Yet, despite the inherent risks, the plan began to take shape. The Greeks would leave behind the horse at the gates of Troy, pretending to retreat and abandon the siege. They would make it seem as though their long campaign had finally come to an end, and with it, the Trojans would be left to celebrate their perceived victory. But inside the wooden horse, hidden and waiting, would be a small but deadly force of Greek warriors, ready to open the gates of Troy and allow the Greek army to storm the city from within. As the plan was set in motion, the atmosphere in the Greek camp was a mixture of anticipation and fear. There was no turning back now. The fate of the war, and the future of both the Greeks and the Trojans, would rest on the shoulders of the soldiers hidden within the horse. They would have to rely on their patience, their stealth, and their ability to execute the plan without error. It was a plan that required not just physical strength, but psychological mastery. The Greeks would have to play on the Trojans' pride, their vanity, and their belief in their own invincibility. It was a game of psychological warfare, and the stakes could not have been higher. In this moment of uncertainty and desperation, as both sides teetered on the edge of exhaustion, the Trojan horse became more than just a piece of wood and rope. It became the symbol of a new kind of warfare, one that would leave behind the brutal violence of the battlefield and enter the realm of manipulation, strategy, and mind games. The creation of the Trojan horse was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of warfare, one that would echo through the centuries as a testament to the power of the human mind in the art of conflict. The relentless siege of Troy had dragged on for nearly a decade. The once vibrant city, filled with the proud sounds of warriors and traders, now echoed with the grim toll of years of conflict. The walls, which had seemed so formidable when the Greeks first arrived, now stood as a bitter reminder of the deadlock between two great powers. From a Greek camp outside the city, the horizon was filled with the ever-present sight of Troy's towering walls, a massive barrier that had thwarted their every attempt to break through. The Trojans, for their part, had shown remarkable resilience, weathering each Greek attack with determination that only seemed to grow as the war dragged on. It was as though the city had become a symbol of invulnerability, a fortress of pride and defiance that no Greek force had been able to conquer. But while the Trojans may have believed their victory was inevitable, they too could not ignore the toll of the years. The war had cost them dearly, and while they had managed to withstand the Greek assault, the cost was evident in the weariness of their people. The sounds of celebration that once echoed to the city in times of peace had given way to the somber tones of soldiers preparing for battle, of citizens mourning their fallen comrades. The supply lines from the countryside, once steady, had begun to shrink, and the once lush fields outside Troy had turned into barren fields of conflict, leaving the Trojans with less and less to sustain their army. While their pride remained intact, there was no escaping the fact that the siege had begun to erode the strength of Troy from within. The city, which had once stood as a symbol of ancient power, was now a shadow of its former self, with its walls no longer as impregnable as they once seemed. The Greek forces, too, were suffering under prolonged siege. The situation had reached a point where the prospect of victory seemed more and more distant. The Greeks had come to Troy with high hopes, their armies fueled by the belief that they would emerge victorious and return home with Helen, their long-lost prize. But now, with the years dragging on and no end in sight, the reality of the situation had begun to sink in. The soldiers, once confident and full of resolve, now found themselves weary, their morale slipping away with each failed assault. Food was becoming scarce, and the Greek camps were filled with the weary groans of soldiers who had lost their appetite for battle. The long campaign had taken its toll on everyone, on the kings, the warriors, the generals, and even the common foot soldiers. There was no escaping the fact that the war had become a war of attrition, one that seemed to favor the Trojans. The commanders of the Greek forces, including the mighty Agamemnon, began to question their approach. Had they miscalculated? Had they underestimated the resilience of Troy? And most importantly, was there any way to end the conflict without further bloodshed, without risking the lives of more of their soldiers? These questions weighed heavily on the Greek leadership as they struggled to find a way out of the seemingly endless conflict. The situation had become dire, and it was clear that without a significant change in strategy, the Greeks might never be able to bring the siege to a successful conclusion. Something needed to shift. But what? It was at this low point, when frustration and desperation were at their peak, that a solution began to take shape. A solution born not of brute force, but of cunning. The Greeks, it seemed, would need to outthink the Trojans rather than outfight them. The mighty walls of Troy, which had repelled every assault thus far, could not be breached through sheer military might alone. But if the Trojans could be tricked, if their pride and sense of invulnerability could be exploited, perhaps there was still a way to win. It was here at the crossroads of desperation and ingenuity that the seeds of the Trojan horse were sown. The Greeks, in their frustration, began to look inward, searching for someone who could provide a way out. and it was in the form of one man, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, renowned not only for his strength in battle but also for his sharp mind and quick wit, that the solution began to emerge. Odysseus, unlike many of his fellow warriors, had never been one to rely solely on brute force. He understood that war was not just a matter of strength, but also of strategy. He was a man who could see the battlefield not just in terms of weapons and soldiers, but in terms of manipulation, psychology, and deception. He was a master of tricks, of turning the tides of battle, not through sheer power, but through the cleverness of his mind. In the midst of the Greek council, Odysseus' voice rang out with a plan that stunned everyone into silence. He proposed that the Greeks, instead of continuing their fruitless attempts to breach the walls, use deception to undermine the Trojans. His plan was as audacious as it was ingenious. The Greeks would build a massive wooden horse, hollowed out to hide a small force of their best warriors. This horse would be left behind as a supposed offering to the gods, a gift to ensure the Greeks' safe departure from Troy. The Greeks would then pretend to retreat from the battlefield, leaving the horse behind as a symbol of surrender, an offering meant to ensure peace. The Trojans, in their weariness and pride, would likely see this as a sign that the Greeks had finally given up. They would bring the horse into their city as a symbol of their triumph, as a symbol of the Greeks' acceptance of defeat. But the horse would not be empty. Inside, hidden from view, would be a small but deadly force of Greek soldiers, poised to strike when the time was right. The Greeks, having feigned retreat, would now wait for the Trojans to lower their guard, to celebrate their supposed victory. Once the horse was safely inside the city walls, the Greek soldiers hidden within would emerge, open the gates, and allow the rest of the Greek army, who had not actually retreated but instead hidden nearby, to rush in and seize Troy from the inside. The brilliance of Odysseus' plan lay in its simplicity. The Trojans would never suspect that the wooden horse, a seemingly harmless gift, was actually a deadly weapon in disguise. The Greeks had taken their greatest strength, their cunning, and turned it into their most effective weapon. The plan was risky, yes, but it was also the Greeks' best hope for ending the war and achieving victory. Odysseus, ever the strategist, had found a way to outmaneuver the Trojans not by attacking them head-on, but by playing on their emotions, their pride, and their sense of invincibility. It was a move that could change the entire course of the war. But as brilliant as the plan was, it was not without its risks. The Greeks had to rely on the Trojans' willingness to accept the gift, to bring the horse into their city, and to fall into the trap that had been set for them. If the Trojans, even for a moment, had any suspicion or hesitation, the entire plan would fall apart. The Greeks would be left exposed, vulnerable, and defeated. The soldiers hidden within the horse would be trapped, and the Greek army, now without their forces inside the city, would be at the mercy of the Trojans. It was a high-stakes gamble, one that required not just cunning, but also a deep understanding of the psychology of war. Odysseus knew that if the plan was to succeed, it would require absolute secrecy, precision, and timing. Every move had to be calculated to the last detail. The Greeks would have to make the Trojans believe that they were completely defeated, that they had given up. The horse, which would be the focal point of the entire strategy, had to be perfect. It had to be large enough to carry soldiers, but small enough to seem like a mere token of surrender. The construction of the horse itself became a crucial part of the plan. Every inch of wood, every rope, every nail had to be carefully crafted to ensure that it would pass as a genuine offering. Once the horse was built, there would be no turning back. The Greeks would have to trust that the Trojans would take the bait and bring the horse inside their walls. As the Greeks set their plan in motion, a sense of nervous excitement filled the camp. They knew that the stakes had never been higher. The war had come down to this one moment, this one final gambit. Would the Trojans fall for the deception, or would they see through the Greeks' ruse? Only time would tell. But for now, all the Greeks could do was wait for the moment when the Trojan horse would either become their greatest victory or their greatest failure. The tide of the war had shifted, and the next move was in the hands of the Trojans. As the Greeks stood on the shores of the Aegean Sea, weary from years of battle, their forces gradually began to feel the weight of uncertainty bearing down on them. The walls of Troy, massive and unyielding, had withstood every assault, every attempt to breach them. The mighty city, defended by its brave warriors and bolstered by the seemingly divine protection of its walls, had proven to be a fortress that no amount of Greek might could overthrow. Yet, Despite the seemingly invincible nature of the Trojans and their city, the Greeks, battered and exhausted as they were, had no choice but to confront the reality that they were at an impasse. The war, which had begun with such lofty goals and fierce determination, had now become a quagmire, a standoff that had sapped the spirit of even the greatest warriors. It was during this time, at the height of the Greeks' frustration and desperation, that a sense of hopelessness began to settle over the camp. The soldiers, their bodies and minds worn down by the grueling siege, began to wonder if there would ever be an end to this endless conflict. Some whispered of returning home, of abandoning the fight altogether. The leaders, once full of confidence and conviction, began to question their decisions, their strategies, and the very purpose of the war. Had they miscalculated? Had they underestimated the strength and resolve of the Trojans? What had once seemed like a just cause, the recovery of Helen, the restoration of honor, now seemed like a distant dream, overshadowed by the harsh realities of prolonged warfare. In this moment of collective disillusionment, it was clear that the Greeks could no longer afford to fight in the same manner. Brute force, it seemed, would never win the day. The endless assaults on Troy's walls, though courageous, had yielded no results. The Greeks had become trapped in a cycle of endless conflict, one that showed no signs of ending. It was clear that something had to change, something radical, something that could break the stalemate that had gripped both armies. But what could that be? What strategy could the Greeks, faced with such insurmountable odds, possibly employ to turn the tide of the war? And it was at this low point, when the Greek leadership was at its most vulnerable, that the seed of an extraordinary idea was planted, an idea that would not only change the course of the war, but also redefine the nature of warfare itself. The Greeks, it seemed, would need to use their minds, not their muscles, to secure victory. The time for direct confrontation had passed. Instead, they would employ subterfuge, deception, and psychological warfare to exploit the one vulnerability that the Trojans had overlooked: their pride. The Greek leader who would rise to the occasion was none other than Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. Odysseus was not just a warrior. He was a master strategist, renowned for his cleverness, his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies. Unlike many of his fellow Greek leaders, who were more accustomed to direct combat and battlefield tactics, Odysseus understood that the greatest weapon in any war was not always the sword or the spear, but the mind. It was with this mindset that he approached the problem of Troy. The Greeks had tried everything, from brute force to cunning battle strategies, but the walls of Troy remained impregnable. The time had come for a new approach, one that would turn the Trojans' greatest asset, their sense of invulnerability, against them. Odysseus, ever the visionary, began to formulate a plan that would defy convention and rely entirely on deception. His idea was simple, yet brilliant. Rather than continue the fruitless assaults on the city, the Greeks would pretend to give up, to accept defeat. They would build a massive wooden horse, hollowed out to house a small group of elite soldiers, and leave it at the gates of Troy as a supposed offering to the gods. This horse, a gift to ensure the Greeks' safe departure from the war, would be presented to the Trojans as a token of peace. The Greeks, in this ruse, would feign their retreat, making it appear as though they were abandoning their campaign altogether. But hidden within the wooden structure would be a small, elite group of warriors, poised to strike when the time was right. The plan was audacious, perhaps even reckless, but it was, in Odysseus' mind, their best hope for achieving victory. The Greeks would leave the horse at the gates of Troy, a symbol of their supposed surrender. The Trojans, proud of their perceived victory, would undoubtedly bring the horse inside their city walls, eager to display it as a symbol of their superiority over the Greeks. Once the horse was inside the city, the Greek soldiers hidden within would emerge, open the gates, and signal the rest of the Greek army, who had seemingly retreated, to return and attack the city from within. It was a scheme that relied on the Trojans' pride, their arrogance, and their belief in their own invincibility. The Greeks would play on these emotions, exploiting the very characteristics that made the Trojans so formidable to their advantage. As the plan began to take shape, the Greeks set to work constructing the Trojan Horse. The sheer scale of the project was a testament to the commitment of the Greek forces and the brilliance of Odysseus' idea. The horse was to be massive, large enough to house a small group of soldiers hidden inside, yet inconspicuous enough to pass as a mere token of surrender. The construction of the horse was meticulous. The Greeks, working day and night, carefully shaped a massive wooden structure, ensuring that it would be both sturdy and hollow, with enough space inside for the soldiers to remain hidden until a moment of truth arrived. The work was grueling, but there was a sense of urgency behind it. Every moment that passed brought them closer to the moment when the fate of the war would rest in the hands of the Trojans. As the horse neared completion, the Greeks began to prepare for their feigned departure. The army would leave behind their camps, packing up their belongings as if they were giving up on the war. The sight of the Greeks' retreat would surely convince the Trojans that they had won, that they had driven the Greeks from their gates. But the Greeks knew better. This retreat was only the beginning of the end for Troy. As the final preparations were made, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. The soldiers who would be hidden within the horse were both anxious and excited. They knew that they were about to play a pivotal role in the outcome of the war. Their success depended entirely on their ability to remain hidden, to wait in silence, and act at the precise moment when their chance to strike would come. The Greeks, now fully committed to their plan, began to leave the area around Troy, making their retreat seem as real as possible. They set fire to their camp, destroyed their fortifications, and left behind all the signs of defeat. The Greeks, in their calculated withdrawal, had ensured that the Trojans would believe the war was over. The great armies of Greece, the warriors who had laid siege to Troy for nearly 10 years, had vanished. Only the wooden horse remained, a silent symbol of the Greeks' departure and surrender. It was then that the Trojans, who had been watching the Greek retreat from their city walls, began to entertain the idea that they had won. The sight of the horse, left behind as an offering to the gods, only added to their sense of triumph. The Greeks, in their minds, had accepted defeat. The horse, a gift that seemed to carry the weight of their surrender, would be a trophy to mark their victory. The Trojans, eager to celebrate their success, began to discuss what to do with the strange offering. Some of the more cautious among them, led by the priest Laocoon, warned against bringing the horse inside the city walls, suspecting it might be a trick. But their concerns were drowned out by the voices of those who saw the horse as a sign of victory, a symbol of the Greek submission. The Trojans, in their pride and sense of invulnerability, were too eager to accept the gift, too blinded by their perceived victory to question its true meaning. In the end, the decision was made. The horse would be brought inside the city, a symbol of Troy's triumph over the Greeks. The city erupted in celebration as the Trojans reveled in their apparent success. They sang songs of victory, feasted in their great halls, and made merry as if the war had ended. Little did they know that the true enemy was already inside their walls, lying in wait for the moment when the final blow would be struck. The Greeks had, through their deception, exploited the very thing that had kept Troy safe for so long: the Trojans' arrogance and pride. It was a calculated gamble, one that would ultimately lead to the downfall of a civilization. The Trojans, in their moment of victory, had sealed their fate, unwittingly inviting their doom into their very heart. The night in Troy was thick with the sounds of celebration, the kind of celebration that often follows a hard-won victory. The Trojans, who had withstood a decade of siege, were now basking in the belief that the war was finally over, that they had triumphed over their Greek enemies. The city, once surrounded by the ominous sight of the Greek camp, now stood in quiet relief. The Greeks, it seemed, had given up. Their camp had been abandoned, their mighty armies nowhere to be seen. The Trojans believed they had driven their enemies away, that their walls, their strength, and their resolve had been enough to break the Greeks. As the celebrations raged, the grand wooden horse, left at their gates as a supposed gift, was wheeled into the heart of the city. It was to be a symbol of their victory, a token of the Greek surrender, a monument to their resilience and might. In the midst of the revelry, the horse stood silently, looming over the festivities like a strange, towering presence. The Trojans, filled with pride and relief, admired the gift, though it seemed out of place amidst their triumph. Some, particularly those with more cautious minds, questioned the wisdom of bringing such an enormous and mysterious object into the city. But their voices were drowned out by the chorus of joy from the others, who saw only a sign of their great victory. The horse was a prize, a trophy, a clear symbol that the Greeks had given up and that Troy had conquered them. It seemed impossible that such a massive and imposing figure could hold anything but goodwill. To the Trojans, it was a token of divine favor, a gift meant to mark the end of their struggles. The horse, however, was far more than it appeared. While the Trojans celebrated their perceived victory, the true nature of the horse was slowly unfolding behind the scenes. Inside the hollow belly of the wooden structure, Greek soldiers lay in silence, holding their breath and waiting with bated anticipation. They knew that their moment was coming, that in the dead of night, when the city had fallen into the deepest sleep, they would emerge in their dark hiding place and strike. The success of the entire operation depended on their ability to remain unseen, to hold their patience, and act swiftly when the time came. The soldiers inside the horse were not there by choice, but by necessity, and their fate was tied to the success of a plan that relied entirely on deception. The Greeks had gambled everything on the hope that the Trojans, in their pride and sense of invulnerability, would fail to see the trap they were walking into. They knew that the Trojans, so accustomed to their own strength and so sure of their victory, would be easy to deceive. The Greeks had also hoped that the Trojans' eagerness to celebrate their success would blind them to the dangers lurking beneath the surface. And so, as the horse was pulled into the heart of Troy, the Greek soldiers inside remained motionless, their hearts pounding in their chests, their eyes fixed on the distant lights of the city, their fate hanging in the balance. There was no turning back now. As the night deepened and the stars twinkled above, the Trojan celebration continued unabated. Wine flowed freely, music filled the air, and warriors who had spent years on the battlefield laughed and danced as if they had never known the horrors of war. It was a night of joy, a night that would go down in history as the day Troy had triumphed over the Greeks. The city was filled with light and noise, a stark contrast to the silent, tense waiting inside the wooden horse. The Greeks, hidden from view, knew that the clock was ticking, that every passing moment brought them closer to the moment when they would have to make their move. They could hear the sounds of the celebration outside, the drunken chatter of the Trojans, the clinking of goblets, and the raucous laughter of soldiers who had no idea that their enemies were already within their walls. Inside the horse, the Greek soldiers moved as little as possible, careful not to make a sound, aware that their lives depended on their ability to remain perfectly still. They had trained for moments like this, learning to control their breathing, to remain patient, to wait for the right moment. The soldiers were elite warriors, men chosen for their ability to carry out this crucial mission. They had been briefed on the details of the plan and knew exactly what they had to do. But none of them could ignore the tension in the air, the palpable sense of danger that hung over them. If they failed, if the Trojans somehow discovered their presence before the signal came, they would be doomed. They would be trapped inside the very city they had come to conquer, caught in a no-win situation where every escape route was blocked, every option limited. It was a game of patience and nerves, one that demanded both skill and courage. The celebrations in Troy grew louder as the night wore on, and with it, the sense of relief among the Trojans swelled. It was as though they had reached the pinnacle of their existence, as though all their suffering, all their sacrifices had finally been vindicated. They had defeated the Greeks, they had kept their city safe, and now they could begin to rebuild, to return to the peace and prosperity that they had known before the war. The horse, once a symbol of Greek pride, had become a symbol of Trojan triumph. It was a token of the gods' favor, a mark of the gods' approval for their strength and perseverance. The Trojans did not see it for what it truly was, a trap waiting to spring, a weapon designed to bring about their downfall. Instead, they saw it as a gift from the gods, a gift that would forever cement their place in the history of the ancient world. As the hours passed, the Greek soldiers inside the horse began to grow restless. The silence was unbearable, and the tension between them was thick. They could hear the sound of the Trojans outside, their voices growing quieter as the night wore on. The Trojans were beginning to tire, their celebration winding down, the lights of the city flickering as the revelry slowed. The soldiers knew that their time was drawing near. The city of Troy was on the verge of slumber, and with it, the opportunity to strike would soon be upon them. The Greeks had no choice but to wait, to hold their breath, and to pray that the Trojan celebrations would carry on long enough to give them the cover they needed. As the night deepened further, the Trojans began to tire from their exertions. The sounds of laughter and music began to fade, replaced by the quieter hum of voices as the soldiers and citizens of Troy retreated to their homes or to their tents. The city, still bathed in the glow of the evening, seemed to settle into a deep, peaceful calm. The Greek soldiers inside the horse remained still, their bodies tense, their muscles aching from the strain of waiting. They knew that soon the moment would arrive. They could feel it in the air, a certain shift, a subtle change in the rhythm of the night. The Trojans were tired, their senses dulled by drink and exhaustion, and soon the time would come to strike. Then, in the stillness of the night, as the last sounds of celebration faded, the signal was given. A single torch was lit, far in the distance, a beacon that would guide the Greek soldiers in their next move. The moment had arrived. The soldiers inside the horse, their hearts pounding with adrenaline, began to stir. They had prepared for this moment for weeks, training themselves for the precise moment when they would have to act. The time had come to open the gates of Troy from within. As the Greek soldiers emerged from the horse, they moved swiftly and silently, their training taking over as they cut through the darkness. The city, still unaware of the threat that was now inside its walls, slept on, oblivious of the fate that was about to unfold. The Greek warriors, their swords drawn, crept through the streets, their every movement calculated, their every step a silent command. The gates were opened, and as the Greek army, hidden just beyond the city, surged forward, the fate of Troy was sealed. The Trojan horse, once a symbol of victory, had now become the instrument of their destruction. The city of Troy, which had been on the cusp of peace, was now thrown into chaos. The Trojans, caught completely off guard, were thrown into a panic, scrambling to defend themselves against an enemy that had been hidden in plain sight. The gates of Troy, once a symbol of strength and security, were now the means of its downfall. The quiet of the night in Troy was shattered in an instant, as the Greeks, who had been hidden within the belly of the wooden horse, now poured into the streets like a wave crashing against the shore. The stillness of the sleeping city, lulled by its celebratory mood and the warmth of its people's triumph, was broken by the sharp clang of metal and the hurried footsteps of men whose purpose was clear: war. The Trojans, who had believed the war was over, had been caught completely off guard. Their defenses, so carefully maintained and so proudly displayed for the past 10 years, now lay in ruins before them. The very city that had withstood the might of the Greek armies for nearly a decade now faced the most dangerous and unexpected of assaults, a strike from within. The first moments of confusion were like a crack in the very foundation of Troy. The Trojans, still drowsy from their celebrations, had no time to gather their thoughts, let alone defend themselves. The Greek soldiers, armed and deadly, swept through the city with precision and purpose. They had spent years preparing for this moment, and now it was time to execute their plan. No mistakes could be made. Every step, every movement had to be flawless. The Trojans, who had grown complacent in their sense of security, were now facing the consequences of their hubris. They had thought the Greeks defeated, their city safe. But in truth, their fate had already been sealed the moment they allowed the horse to enter their gates. As the Greek soldiers rushed through the streets, their first objective was clear: open the gates. The gates of Troy, which had stood as the final line of defense against the Greek forces for so many years, were now the key to the city's downfall. The Greeks knew that if they could open those gates, the rest of their army, hidden just beyond the city's walls, would be able to pour in and take the city by storm. The soldiers inside the horse, who had waited for so long in the cramped and darkened space, now sprang into action with silent, almost deadly efficiency. They had been trained for this moment, and now it was time to fulfill their role in the Greeks' grand plan. The moment the gates creaked open, the full force of the Greek army surged forward. What had begun as a subtle trick, a feigned retreat, a gift left behind as a token of surrender, had now transformed into a full-scale attack. The Greeks had laid the groundwork for their victory over years of planning, and now the moment had come to strike. The soldiers who had been hiding in the horse, who had spent hours lying in wait, now moved quickly and deliberately, opening the gates wide enough for the rest of the Greek army to rush through. The soldiers outside, who had pretended to leave, now came charging back into the city with all the fury of a storm. The city, once secure and proud, was now in chaos. At first, the Trojans had no idea what was happening. The noise of battle seemed to come from every direction at once. There was no way to know where the enemy was, no way to find their footing in the confusion. The streets that had been filled with celebration just hours ago now echoed with the sounds of screams, of clashing swords, and the frantic cries of citizens who suddenly found themselves in the midst of a nightmare. In those first moments, panic set in. Soldiers scrambled to defend their homes, their families, but it was already too late. The Greeks, who had been waiting just outside the gates, now flooded into the city, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Amidst the chaos, the Trojan leaders, including King Priam and his sons, struggled to make sense of the situation. Priam, a king who had long prided himself on the strength of his city and his people, was now forced to reckon with the bitter truth. Troy, for all its might, was not invincible. His city, the city that had resisted for so long, was now being torn apart from within. There was no time for strategy, no time for coordinated defense. The Trojans had been blindsided, their pride and sense of invulnerability now their undoing. As the Greeks fought their way through the streets, their main goal was clear: to take control of the citadel. The citadel of Troy, with its towering walls and high ground, was the heart of the city, the last bastion of Trojan strength. Whoever controlled the citadel controlled the city. For the Greeks, the citadel was the key to their final victory. The Trojans, though confused and disoriented, understood this as well. They knew that if they lost the citadel, their entire city would fall. Within the citadel, the defenders, led by Hector's brother, Prince Paris, tried to mount a desperate resistance, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The Greeks, their strategy executed to perfection, now held the upper hand. The Trojans, exhausted and unprepared for such a sudden attack, were unable to mount an effective defense. The Greeks, though fewer in number than the Trojans, were led by some of the greatest warriors of their age: Odysseus, Achilles, and the other heroes of the war, each of whom fought with ruthless efficiency born of years of battle and strategy. For the Trojans, this was a fight unlike any they had ever experienced. They were fighting not just for their city, but for their very survival. Inside the citadel, the chaos continued to unfold. Priam, desperate to protect his people and his family, tried to organize a defense, but the Greeks were already inside. They had reached the heart of Troy, and with each passing minute, the city's fall seemed inevitable. The sounds of battle grew louder, filling the streets, echoing through the grand halls and chambers of the once mighty city. The citizens of Troy, caught in the middle of this nightmare, could only try to flee or take up arms in a futile attempt to protect their homes. The Greek warriors, knowing that their moment of victory was close at hand, fought with unmatched intensity. They had spent years laying the groundwork for this very moment, and now it was theirs to claim. The Trojans, caught off guard and unprepared, were overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Greek assault. The Greeks knew that there was no room for hesitation, no time for mercy. The time for strategy had passed. Now it was a matter of survival. In the midst of the chaos, Priam and his family took refuge in the royal palace, hoping that it would offer some protection. But even here, there was no safety. The Greeks, their numbers now overwhelming, broke down the doors of the palace and poured into the inner chambers. Priam, once a mighty king, now found himself in a position he had never imagined, pleading for his life in the face of a city he had once ruled with such authority. The Greeks, in their victory, showed little mercy. Troy, which had once been the jewel of the Aegean, was now in ruins. Outside the palace, the streets of Troy were a battleground. The Greek soldiers, having secured control of the citadel, now fought their way through every corner of the city. The Trojans, with no way to organize a coherent defense, were scattered and disoriented. The battle raged through the narrow streets, into the homes and temples, and through the markets where merchants once peddled their goods. The city, which had once been filled with life and vibrancy, was now a place of death and destruction. The Greeks, having waited for so long for this moment, now fought with everything they had. For the Trojans, it was a nightmare, a dream turned into a horrific reality. As the night wore on, the sounds of battle began to fade. The city that had once stood as a beacon of strength and pride now lay in ruins. The Greeks, having conquered Troy from within, stood victorious, their enemies broken, their city destroyed. The once great city of Troy, with its towering walls and proud history, had been brought to its knees, not by the might of the Greek army, but by the cleverness and deceit of a single idea. The Trojan Horse, which had entered the city as a symbol of peace, had now become the weapon of Troy's destruction. The city, which had endured for so many years, was now nothing more than a shadow of its former self. Its proud walls crumbled, its people scattered, and its future uncertain. In the wake of the Greek victory, Troy was left in ruins, a once great city reduced to ashes and memories. The Greeks, having achieved their long-awaited triumph, now turned their attention to the spoils of war. Helen, the woman whose beauty had sparked the conflict, was returned to her husband Menelaus. The Greek warriors, having completed their mission, now prepared to leave the city, their triumph complete. But even in victory, there was no real celebration. For the Greeks, the war had come at a great cost. The destruction of Troy, while a significant victory, had left a bitter taste in their mouths. The gods, whose wills had shaped the outcome of the war, watched from afar, indifferent to the suffering and the carnage that had unfolded. The Trojan horse, once a symbol of deception, now stood as a reminder of the fragility of power, the fallibility of pride, and the price of victory. The devastation that followed the fall of Troy was profound, and in many ways, it signified the end of an era. The Greeks, having conquered the city from within, found themselves not only victorious, but burdened with a sense of grim realization. What they had achieved was not just the destruction of an enemy, but the shattering of a world. For all the years of bloodshed, the years of sacrifice, and the pain endured by both sides, there was an eerie sense of emptiness that now hovered over the ruins of Troy. As the Greeks took control of the city, they were confronted by the undeniable truth. Their victory, hard-earned and long-awaited, had come at an immense cost. The Trojans, now prisoners in their own land, faced an uncertain future. The city, once filled with life, had been reduced to a graveyard of broken walls and charred remains. The sounds of battle had long since faded, replaced by the silence of the conquered. The Greeks, though they had won, were not the triumphant heroes that their legends would make them out to be. As they wandered the streets of the city they had fought so hard to destroy, many of the warriors were haunted by what they had done. The great walls of Troy, which had stood tall for centuries, were now crumbling under the weight of war. The same streets that once echoed with the sounds of laughter and joy now lay silent, haunted by the ghosts of the past. For the Trojans, the fall of their city was not just a defeat. It was a betrayal of everything they had believed in. For years, they had held firm, defending their homes, their families, and their way of life. They had fought against a force they believed was unjust, a force that had come to take away everything they held dear. And yet, in the end, it was not the strength of their warriors or the might of their gods that saved them, but the cleverness and deceit of their enemies. The wooden horse, once a symbol of Greek surrender, had become the tool of their undoing. The Trojans, in their pride and their overconfidence, had been outwitted by a trick, and now they were paying the price for their hubris. For the Greek leaders, particularly Odysseus, the victory was bittersweet. As the architect of the Trojan horse, Odysseus had achieved what seemed impossible. His cunning and deception had turned the tide of the war and delivered the Greeks to the gates of Troy. But even as he walked through the now silent streets of the city, his triumph felt hollow. The cost of the war had been far higher than anyone had anticipated. The men who had fought alongside him, his comrades in arms, were not celebrating. They were grieving. The bodies of their fallen comrades, the lives lost in battle, the friends who would never return, all of it hung heavily on their minds. The Greeks had destroyed Troy, but they had also destroyed something of themselves in the process. As the Greeks gathered the spoils of their war, the reality of their actions began to settle in. They had not only conquered a city, they had decimated a culture. The great treasures of Troy, the jewels and gold, were now in the hands of the victors. But these treasures, once symbols of Trojan pride and prosperity, now serve as reminders of the violence that had led to their acquisition. There was no joy in the taking of these spoils. The Greeks, though they had won the war, had lost a part of their humanity in the process. The screams of the dying, the cries of those who had lost loved ones, the sight of Troy burning, it all left an indelible mark on the victors. The destruction of Troy was not only a military victory, but a cultural and emotional one. The Greeks had shattered the very foundations of Troy, bringing down not only the physical walls, but also the pride of a people. But in doing so, they had also lost something of their own. The gods, who had played such a significant role in the war, watched from above, indifferent to the destruction below. It was as if the victory itself had been part of a greater cosmic game, one that neither the Greeks nor the Trojans could fully understand. In the end, the gods remained silent, their hands washed of the blood that had been spilled. The spoils of war, as they always do, carried with them a heavy burden. The Greeks, having fought so long and so hard to achieve their victory, now found themselves trapped by the very thing they had sought: revenge. The city of Troy, which had once been a symbol of pride and power, now lay in ruins, its treasures and its people in the hands of the victors. The Greeks, though they had won, had also lost. They had achieved their goal, but in doing so, they had been transformed. The cost of their victory was steep, and the toll it had taken on them would be felt for years to come. And then there was Helen, whose beauty had sparked the war in the first place, now found herself in the midst of it all. She had been the catalyst for the destruction of Troy, the reason for the death and suffering of so many. And now, as the city fell, she found herself in the arms of her husband, Menelaus, once again. But there was no joy in their reunion. The love that had once united them seemed distant now, overshadowed by the events that had transpired. Helen had played her part in the story, but it was clear that the consequences of her actions had far outstripped her understanding of what she had set in motion. The war, the death, the destruction, none of it could be undone. And as Menelaus took her back, there was no grand celebration, no happy ending, only the quiet recognition that the past could never be erased, that the wounds of Troy would never fully heal. The Greeks, having destroyed Troy, now faced their own reckoning. Their victory had been complete, but their triumph was fleeting. The road home would not be an easy one. The gods, fickle and vengeful as ever, were not pleased with the destruction wrought by the Greeks. Though they had won the war, the Greeks would now have to face the consequences of their actions. The gods would not allow them to return home unscathed. What had been won on the battlefield would now be paid for in suffering. The Greeks, victorious though they were, would find that the true cost of war was not just in the lives lost, but in the lives that were yet to be lost. The gods, who had once taken sides, now watched from their distant thrones, indifferent to the fate of mortals. The Greek soldiers, who had fought so valiantly for so many years, would soon find that their victory would be followed by a long, hard journey home. The tales of the Trojan War, which would live on for centuries to come, would be stories of glory, betrayal, cunning, and destruction. But beneath those stories lay the truth. War leaves scars, and those scars are not easily healed. For the Greeks, the fall of Troy was a victory, but it was a victory that came at a tremendous cost. As the Greeks set sail to return home, the city of Troy continued to smolder in the distance. Its walls, once so proud, were now reduced to rubble, and its people, who had once been strong and defiant, were now either dead or enslaved. The Greeks, though they had achieved their goal, had also lost something in the process. They had destroyed Troy, but in doing so, they had destroyed a part of themselves. The Trojan Horse, which had been the instrument of their victory, now stood as a monument to the cost of their triumph. In the years that followed, the stories of Troy would be passed down from generation to generation. They would be told in grand halls and around campfires, spoken by poets and historians, and remembered by all who came after. But the true cost of the war, the true price of victory, would never be fully understood. The Greeks had won, but in the end, they too had been broken by the war. The fall of Troy would forever be a reminder that even the mightiest of civilizations could be brought down by deceit and pride, and that no victory, no matter how sweet, comes without its price. The aftermath of Troy's fall was a time of profound silence and mourning. As the Greek soldiers sailed away, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of what had once been a proud city, the weight of their victory settled heavily on them. What they had accomplished, the destruction of Troy, was a culmination of years of war, sacrifice, and bloodshed. Yet, as they left the shores of Troy, it became increasingly apparent that the sense of triumph they expected was missing. Instead, there was a void, a lingering sense of dread that seemed to hang over them. They had won the war, but they had lost something in the process, something intangible but deeply felt. The gods, who had watched the war unfold from their celestial thrones, did not appear to be pleased by the Greeks' victory. Their wrath, like a storm gathering on the horizon, was about to descend on the very men who believed they had earned a hard-fought triumph. For the Greeks, the sense of unease began to take root even as they left the Trojan coast. The gods, fickle and capricious, had made their displeasure known before, and now, with the city of Troy reduced to rubble, their anger would have consequences. The Greeks had violated sacred laws, their actions staining the very fabric of their existence. The Trojan War had been a war of pride, vengeance, and hubris, elements that, according to the will of the gods, were never to go unpunished. Now, as the victors set sail to return home, they would learn that their triumph would not go unchallenged. The gods' displeasure with the Greeks was most evident in their treatment of the leaders who had been at the forefront of the war. Odysseus, who had masterminded the cunning trick of the Trojan Horse, was perhaps the most famous of the Greek leaders. His intellect and strategic mind had won the war, but his victory would come at a steep price. Odysseus, as he began his long journey home, was haunted by the idea that the gods would not let him return to Ithaca without enduring hardship. In fact, the gods had already set their sights on him. The trick that had brought Troy to its knees, the deceitful ploy that had allowed the Greeks to win, had drawn the ire of Poseidon, the god of the sea. In Poseidon's eyes, Odysseus' success was not the result of heroic action, but of a grievous act of dishonor, a trick that had undermined the gods themselves. And so, Odysseus, despite being a hero in the eyes of men, would find himself the subject of the gods' wrath. As the winds carried him farther from Troy, Odysseus encountered numerous challenges. His ship, caught in the stormy seas, was blown off course time and time again. His men, exhausted and disheartened, were forced to face the consequences of their actions. The Greeks had desecrated Troy, and in doing so, they had incurred the wrath of the gods. Now they would pay the price. The journey home was no longer one of celebration. It had become a quest for survival. Odysseus, known for his wit and cunning, would have to rely on his intelligence to navigate the treacherous seas, facing one god's wrath after another. But Odysseus was not alone in his suffering. The other Greek leaders, too, found themselves struggling to return home. Menelaus, whose wife Helen had been the cause of the war, faced his own trials as he sailed back to Sparta. Helen, once the cause of so much destruction, was now returning to her husband, but their reunion was not one of joy. The war had shattered their relationship, and though they were reunited, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. The scars of the war ran deep, and the Greeks' homecoming was tainted by the knowledge that their victory had come at a great cost. Even if they were able to return to their cities, their homes would never feel the same. The men who had fought the hardest in Troy, the warriors like Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, and the great Ajax, each felt the weight of their actions. They had defeated the Trojans, but their souls were battered and broken by what they had done. The violence, the bloodshed, and the loss of so many of their own comrades weighed heavily on them. No matter how they tried to make sense of their actions, there was no denying that Troy's fall was a victory built on lies and deception. The Greeks had tricked the Trojans into believing that they had surrendered, that they had given up the fight, only to strike when they were at their most vulnerable. It was a tactic that had been successful, but one that left an indelible mark on the warriors who had carried it out. For the Greeks, the idea of victory was no longer something to be celebrated. The gods had made it clear that they would not allow such a hollow triumph to go unpunished. The journey home was no longer a straightforward return to glory. It was fraught with danger, hardship, and the constant presence of divine retribution. As the warriors sailed, one by one, they encountered the wrath of the gods, each suffering in their own way for the crimes committed during the war. The most iconic of these trials, and the one that would become the subject of countless stories, was Odysseus's prolonged journey home. It was a journey that would take him 10 years, far longer than the war itself had lasted. In these 10 years, Odysseus encountered gods, monsters, and treacherous seas. His ship was wrecked by Poseidon. He encountered the sirens whose songs threatened to pull his men to their doom, and he faced the Cyclops Polyphemus, whose blindness would be one of Odysseus's greatest tricks. Through it all, Odysseus displayed the wit and cunning that had made him famous. But even in his success, there was no escape from the consequences of the Trojan War. Every victory came at a cost. Every triumph brought with it a new set of trials. In the end, when Odysseus finally returns to Ithaca, he does so not as a triumphant hero, but as a broken man. His journey has taken its toll on him. He has seen the gods' wrath firsthand and has suffered immensely because of it. His homecoming is one of reclamation, not of glory. He must fight once again, this time not against enemies on the battlefield, but against the suitors who have overrun his home in his absence. Even in his return, there is no peace. The gods, it seems, have made sure that no victory is ever truly complete, no peace ever truly permanent. The trials faced by Odysseus are emblematic of the larger truth that the Greeks, as a whole, would come to realize in the aftermath of the Trojan War. That war, even when won, leaves scars that cannot be healed easily. The gods, with their capriciousness and their inability to forgive the transgressions of men, ensured that the Greek victors would never truly find peace. The Trojan War, for all its victories and accomplishments, was a war that destroyed both sides. The Greeks, despite their eventual success, would never be able to return to the lives they had left behind. As the years passed, the Greek leaders and warriors who had been involved in the war were left to reflect on their actions. Many would not live to see the fruits of their victories. Their fates, shaped by the gods' wrath, were as tragic as the war itself. Some, like Agamemnon, met violent ends at the hands of those closest to them. Others, like Achilles, were immortalized in legend, but their stories were tinged with the knowledge that their greatness had been built on the foundation of immense bloodshed and loss. The survivors of the war, both Greek and Trojan, carried with them the weight of what had been lost. Troy, once a symbol of power and pride, was now nothing more than a memory. Its people scattered, enslaved, or dead. The Greeks had destroyed what was left of the Trojan legacy, but in doing so, they had destroyed their own sense of self as well. The war had ravaged both sides, and no one had emerged unscathed. And so, as the stories of Troy were passed down through generations, they became a cautionary tale. The gods, ever present in the lives of mortals, reminded the Greeks that even the greatest of victories come with consequences. The Trojan War was not just a war between two great cities. It was a war between mortals and the gods, a war that had shown that neither side could truly win. And in the end, it was the gods who held the final victory, their vengeance eternal, as the Greeks paid for their pride, their arrogance, and their deceit. The fall of Troy marked the end of an age in which the gods had walked among men, and in which the consequences of war were not merely the destruction of cities, but the destruction of souls. The war had ended, but the echoes of its violence, its destruction, and its sorrow lingered far beyond the walls of Troy. As the Greeks sailed away from the city, victorious but burdened by a deep sense of unease, the question on every mind was not simply how to return home, but what they would return to. Victory, in its most brutal form, had been achieved, but the costs of that victory were immeasurable, and the repercussions of their actions had only just begun to unfold. The city of Troy had fallen, its walls crumbling, its people either dead or enslaved, but for those who had fought for the Greeks, the true consequences were about to be paid, and the gods had their own plans for those who believed they had won. The gods, ever vengeful and never to be ignored, had already begun to weave their own fate for the Greek heroes who had orchestrated the fall of Troy. Their anger, a dark and looming presence, followed them like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Among the Greeks, there was no sense of peaceful return. There was only a grim realization that no one, not even the victors, could escape the judgment of the gods. In their eyes, the Greeks had committed an unforgivable crime. The ransacking of Troy, the slaughter of its people, the desecration of its temples, these were all acts that demanded punishment. The gods, having watched the events unfold, now exacted their toll. For some, this divine retribution was swift and overwhelming. Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces, would be one of the first to feel the full weight of the gods' anger. Though he had led the Greeks to victory, his return to Mycenae was met not with celebration, but with death. The gods, as always, had ensured that no victory was without its consequences. Agamemnon, hailed as a hero, would be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra in a brutal act of vengeance for the sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon had, in his desperation to win the war, allowed the gods to demand the life of his daughter, believing that such a sacrifice would ensure the Greeks' victory. But this act of devotion to the gods had cost him dearly. Clytemnestra, consumed with rage and grief, took matters into her own hands, murdering Agamemnon in his own home. In a cruel twist, The great leader who had led the Greeks to their hard-won victory was slain by those closest to him. His family, once proud and powerful, was now torn apart by bloodshed and betrayal. Agamemnon's death was just the beginning. His son, Orestes, would later return from exile to avenge his father's murder, perpetuating the cycle of violence that seemed inescapable. The gods had made sure that the cycle of vengeance would continue, and the royal house of Atreus would be forever marked by tragedy. The gods, having already condemned Agamemnon to a grim fate, now ensured that his family would suffer for generations to come. The bloodshed that had begun on the fields of Troy, with the murder of innocent civilians and the slaughter of warriors, would never truly end. Even in the Greek cities, where the victorious soldiers would return to their homes, the gods' judgment lingered, a reminder that no one, no matter how great or powerful, was ever truly free from the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, Odysseus, the mastermind behind the Trojan Horse and the strategist who had led the Greeks to victory, faced a different kind of reckoning. The gods, particularly Poseidon, were unforgiving of the deceit that had brought Troy to its knees. Odysseus, in his cleverness, had outwitted the Trojans, using their pride and their trust to trick them into accepting the wooden horse. The victory, while brilliant in its execution, had been built on a lie. And for this lie, Poseidon had set in motion a series of trials that would torment Odysseus for years to come. The journey that Odysseus embarked upon after the fall of Troy was one of suffering, wandering, and loss. His ship was tossed by storms, his men faced monsters, and he himself was ensnared by the gods' will. But it was not just the wrath of Poseidon that Odysseus had to contend with. Each trial he faced was not just a test of his physical endurance, but of his soul. The gods were forcing him to reckon with the consequences of his actions, forcing him to pay for the deceit that had led to Troy's downfall. The hero who had once been celebrated for his cleverness and wit now found himself trapped in a labyrinth of divine punishment, each step further away from home, further away from peace. For 10 years, Odysseus journeyed through a world that seemed intent on breaking him. He encountered the Cyclops Polyphemus, whose island became a trap for him and his men. He had to face the seductive allure of the Sirens, whose songs threatened to pull his men to their doom. He was tested by Circe, who transformed his men into swine, and by the treacherous waters of Scylla and Charybdis, where death awaited no matter which way he turned. Each of these trials was a direct result of the gods' anger, a reminder that Odysseus, despite his victory, had no escape from the retribution of those he had wronged. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, had seen his cleverness and now forced him to reckon with it. As Odysseus continued his journey, he was also forced to confront his own flaws. His cunning, which had won him the war, now led him into dangerous situations, and his pride, which had driven him to deceive the Trojans, now drove him further away from his goal. He faced the consequences of not only his actions in the war, but also his own hubris, his inability to recognize the danger in his own cleverness. His refusal to acknowledge that the gods controlled his fate became his greatest obstacle. The very traits that had made him a hero now turned him into a tragic figure. Despite his brilliance, Odysseus could not outrun the punishment that had been decreed by the gods. His return to Ithaca was not the grand homecoming that many had imagined. Instead, it was a hard-won reclamation of his kingdom. Odysseus found his home overrun with suitors who had taken advantage of his absence to attempt to marry his wife, Penelope. The gods, still displeased with his deception in Troy, made sure that his victory over these suitors was not without cost. Odysseus, returning to his homeland as a shadow of the man he once was forced to fight once again, not just for his throne but for his identity. His reunion with Penelope was fraught with tension and uncertainty, as the gods had ensured that nothing in his life would ever return to what it had been before. For the other heroes who had participated in the Trojan War, the consequences were no less severe. Menelaus, whose wife Helen had sparked the war, found his return to Sparta clouded by the same sense of unease that plagued the other victors. Helen, whose beauty had been the cause of so much suffering, was now back at his side, but their relationship was irrevocably altered. The years of war, the years of suffering and loss, had left their mark on both of them. Their reunion, which should have been a moment of joy, was instead a grim acknowledgement that their lives, like the war itself, would never be the same. The gods, in their infinite power, had ensured that no peace would come to those who had waged war. The fall of Troy, though a monumental victory for the Greeks, marked the beginning of an even greater struggle for those who had survived. The gods, ever watchful and vengeful, had seen the war and its aftermath as a betrayal of the natural order. The Greeks had destroyed Troy, but in doing so, they had set into motion a chain of events that would forever change their fates. The gods' punishment was not a simple matter of retribution. It was a reminder that no victory, no matter how great, comes without a price. The heroes of Troy, though celebrated in song and story, would live with the knowledge that their triumph was hollow, their victory marked by divine disapproval. As the years passed, the gods continued to weave their intricate web of fate, ensuring that no one who had participated in the war would ever find peace. The Trojan War, though ended, would never be forgotten. It would echo through the ages as a story not just of battle and bloodshed, but of divine judgment and the inescapable consequences of human pride. The fall of Troy and the revenge of the gods would live on in the stories of the victors and the vanquished alike, a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of fate. In the years following the fall of Troy, the shadow of its destruction hung over both the victors and the vanquished. For the Greeks, the ultimate victory, which had been achieved with the most deceptive and cunning of means, became a hollow triumph. Though they had torn down the walls of Troy and wiped out its once proud civilization, the cost of this victory was something they could not escape. The gods, whose influence had been felt in every battle and every decision, ensured that the Greeks would not be allowed to return to their homes unscathed. Their wrath, though delayed, was inevitable. The victory that had been celebrated with so much joy in a moment became a burden, one that weighed heavily on those who had fought to secure it. As the Greek heroes sailed back to their homeland, they found themselves caught in a web of divine retribution. The gods, who had once favored the Greeks for their bravery and their strength, were now disillusioned with them. The Greeks had, after all, violated the sanctity of war. They had used deception and trickery to bring about the fall of Troy, and in doing so, they had dishonored the very ideals of heroism and honor. The Trojan Horse, which had seemed like the perfect instrument of victory, had actually been the weapon that sealed their fates. It was a symbol of betrayal, a gift that had been offered in peace, but which hid within it the seeds of destruction. The Greeks, who had thought they had outsmarted their enemies, were now facing the consequences of their own cunning. For Odysseus, the mastermind behind the Trojan Horse, the punishment was perhaps the most severe. The gods, especially Poseidon, took great offense at the trickery that had been employed to bring Troy to its knees. The Greek hero, who had once been celebrated for his wisdom and intelligence, now found himself at the mercy of the very gods he had once relied upon. His journey home, which should have been one of celebration, became a long and painful ordeal. His ship was blown off course, caught in fierce storms and violent seas, and his men, who had once fought so bravely by his side, perished one by one. The god Poseidon, seeking revenge for the harm caused by Odysseus' actions, ensured that the hero would never find peace. Each trial that Odysseus faced, whether it was the encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the seductive lure of the Sirens, or the deadly threats of Scylla and Charybdis, was a direct consequence of the dishonor he had brought upon the gods. His cleverness had led to Troy's downfall, but it had also drawn the gods' wrath, and now there was no escape from it. Though Odysseus endured these trials with his typical resourcefulness, each new challenge took its toll. His men, who had once followed him with unquestioning loyalty, began to lose hope. They had been promised a swift and glorious return home, but instead they found themselves lost in a never-ending journey fraught with dangers. The promise of returning to Ithaca seemed more distant with each passing day, and the burden of leadership grew heavier for Odysseus. The hero, who had once been so certain of his own intelligence, now faced the crushing realization that he had been cursed by the gods. His journey was not just a physical one, but a moral and spiritual odyssey, a test of character as much as of endurance. For the other Greek heroes, the aftermath of Troy's fall was no less grim. Menelaus, who had fought to reclaim his wife Helen, found no solace in her return. Helen, whose beauty had sparked the war, was now at his side, but their relationship had been irreparably damaged by the years of conflict and bloodshed. Menelaus, though victorious, could not escape the emptiness that now defined his life. The Trojan War had taken everything from him, his peace, his family's unity, and his sense of self. The war, which had been sparked by Helen's abduction, had ultimately destroyed the very thing it was meant to restore. Menelaus returned to Sparta with his wife. But the kingdom that he had fought so hard to reclaim was no longer the same. The city, which had once been a symbol of strength and pride, now seemed like a hollow shell of what it had been. There was no joy in Menelaus's homecoming, only the harsh reality that the cost of war had been too great. Similarly, Agamemnon, the great leader of the Greek forces, could not escape the consequences of his actions. Though he had led the Greeks to victory at Troy, he returned home to a kingdom that was anything but peaceful. His wife, Clytemnestra, who had been left behind in Mycenae during the war, had plotted her revenge. Agamemnon had sacrificed their daughter, Iphigenia, in order to secure favorable winds for the Greek fleet, an act that had soured his relationship with his wife. Clytemnestra, consumed with grief and rage, murdered Agamemnon upon his return, condemning him to the same fate that he had imposed on his daughter. The gods, in their divine wisdom, had ensured that Agamemnon would face the consequences of his decisions, and his death marked the beginning of a cycle of violence and vengeance that would tear apart his family for generations to come. His death, though inevitable, was a tragic reminder that the gods could not be escaped, and that even the mightiest of heroes were not immune to their judgment. For the Trojans, the fall of their city was just the beginning of their suffering. The Greeks may have taken the city, but the true cost of the war was only beginning to be realized. The Trojans had lost everything: home, family, and future, and now they faced the prospect of being enslaved by the victors. The great city of Troy, which had once stood as a beacon of civilization, was now in ruins, and its people were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Priam, the noble king of Troy, had been killed by Achilles' son Neoptolemus, and his once proud family had been scattered. The women of Troy, including the noble queen Hecuba, were taken as slaves, and many of the Trojan warriors were either killed or forced into servitude. The gods, who had once been revered by the Trojans, had not come to their aid. The Trojan gods had been powerless in the face of the Greek onslaught, and now the survivors faced the harsh reality of life under their conquerors. The great city of Troy was no more, and with it, the Trojans' hopes for a future. But for some, the fall of Troy was only the beginning of their personal journey. Aeneas, the son of the Trojan prince Anchises, escaped the burning city and embarked on a journey that would take him across the Mediterranean. Aeneas, unlike many of the Trojan leaders, was determined to survive and to rebuild. The gods had spared him for a purpose. He was destined to found a new kingdom, one that would eventually become the Roman Empire. His journey, though filled with loss and hardship, was a story of resilience. Aeneas, despite the many obstacles he faced, never lost sight of his destiny. His survival was not just a matter of fate, but a testament to the perseverance of the Trojan people. His journey was a symbol of the hope that, even in the face of utter destruction, life could go on. His descendants would carry the legacy of Troy, and their story would eventually be immortalized in the Roman Empire. As for the Greek victors, the price of their success was becoming clearer with each passing year. The gods, whose favor had once been guaranteed by the Greeks' strength and bravery, now turned their backs on them. The gods had granted them victory, but at what cost? The men who had fought at Troy, who had once been hailed as heroes, now found themselves haunted by the consequences of their actions. The gods had not forgotten the destruction of Troy, and their vengeance would continue to reverberate through the generations. No hero, no matter how great, was exempt from the will of the gods. The Greeks had thought that their victory was assured, but in the end, it was the gods who had the final say. The story of the Trojan War and the aftermath of its destruction became a cautionary tale, one that would be passed down for generations. The Greeks, though victorious, were forced to confront the reality that their triumph was tainted by deceit, by dishonor, and by the wrath of the gods. Their victory, which had seemed so sweet at the time, became a bitter reminder of the consequences of war. The Trojans, despite their defeat, were not without their own stories of resilience and hope. The fall of Troy, though catastrophic, did not mark the end of the Trojan legacy. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, had ensured that the story of Troy would live on, a story of glory, of tragedy, and of the inescapable consequences of human actions. The Greek victors, despite the bloodshed and the sorrow that followed the fall of Troy, could not escape the weight of their own decisions. The gods, who had been silently watching throughout the entire war, now turned their full attention to those who had participated in the deceitful victory. While the Greeks had been heralded as heroes in their homelands, their triumph over Troy was, in many ways, a hollow one, stained with treachery and divine retribution. The wooden horse, which had seemed like an instrument of brilliance in the moment, now stood as a symbol of their moral downfall. The gods, omnipotent and unyielding, would not let the Greek success go unpunished. The true cost of their victory began to reveal itself, and it was clear that no one would return to their homes without facing the consequences of the role they had played in the destruction of Troy. For Odysseus, whose cunning mind had devised a trick that led to Troy's downfall, the punishment was especially harsh. It was his brilliance that had outwitted the Trojans, but it was also his deceit that had angered the gods. Odysseus, who had been known for his wisdom and tactical genius, found himself caught in the web of divine retribution, suffering for the very cleverness that had won him glory. The gods, especially Poseidon, whose son Polyphemus had been blinded by Odysseus, took offense of the hero's actions and subjected him to a long, torturous journey home, one that would stretch across 10 years. Each obstacle Odysseus encountered, be it the sirens, the Cyclops, or the wrath of the gods, was not just a test of his physical endurance, but a trial of his character. His journey, though filled with peril, was also an exploration of his soul. The gods made sure that Odysseus would face the consequences of his choices at every turn. His trickery in Troy had not gone unnoticed, and the gods, in their inscrutable wisdom, ensured that he would never reach Ithaca without first paying the price. The great hero's return to Ithaca was a far cry from the homecoming he had once imagined. What should have been a time of reunion with his beloved wife, Penelope, and son, Telemachus, was instead marked by a brutal reclamation of his kingdom. The suitors who had taken advantage of Odysseus' absence had overrun his home, and the hero was forced to confront not only his own misdeeds, but the consequences of those actions. Even in victory, there was no peace for Odysseus. The gods, still displeased with his role in the fall of Troy, made sure that his return was nothing like the triumph he had once envisioned. He had to prove his worth once again, not only to the gods, but to his family and his people. His journey was marked by hardships that seemed to be an eternal reminder that the gods were always watching, and their wrath was always close at hand. For Menelaus, whose wife Helen had been the spark that ignited the war, the return was no less bittersweet. He had fought for years to reclaim his wife and bring her back to Sparta, but the victory felt empty. The Trojan War, which had begun because of Helen's beauty and her abduction, had cost the lives of countless men, and now that she was back in his arms, Menelaus found that their relationship had been irrevocably altered. Helen, once the cause of so much destruction, now stood beside her husband, but their love had been tainted by the years of conflict. The bond they shared was no longer one of undying love, but a complex and painful reminder of all that had been lost. Menelaus had won his wife back, but the cost of that victory was far greater than he had ever imagined. The gods had ensured that he would never find true happiness, for his triumph over Troy had been built on the destruction of another civilization. The love that had once seemed so pure now seemed fractured and distant, overshadowed by the horrors of war. Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces, had faced his own tragic fate. His return to Mycenae was supposed to mark the end of his long campaign, but instead, it became the beginning of a tragic cycle of vengeance. Agamemnon's decision to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, in order to secure favorable winds for the Greek fleet had irreparably damaged his relationship with his wife, Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra, consumed by grief and anger, waited for her husband's return, plotting her revenge. When Agamemnon finally returned, weary and triumphant, he was met with death at the hands of his wife. Clytemnestra's murder of her husband was not just an act of revenge for the sacrifice of their daughter, but a direct challenge to the very idea of Greek heroism. Agamemnon's death was a reminder that, even for the mightiest of warriors, there was no escape from the consequences of their actions. The gods had ensured that Agamemnon's victory would be short-lived, for his arrogance in sacrificing his own flesh and blood had not gone unnoticed. The gods had passed their judgment, and Agamemnon's family was left in ruins, caught in a never-ending cycle of bloodshed and betrayal. As Agamemnon's fate showed, The Greek leaders were not the only ones who had to face the consequences of their actions. The warriors who had fought so valiantly at Troy were also caught in the web of divine punishment. Achilles, the greatest of all Greek warriors, had been immortalized in the Iliad as the quintessential hero, a warrior whose strength and prowess were unmatched on the battlefield. But even Achilles, despite his unparalleled skill, could not escape the consequences of the war. His death, though heroic, was ultimately a reminder of the fleeting nature of glory. The gods had ensured that Achilles would meet his end, and his fate became a symbol of the fragility of human existence. His legacy, though immortalized in legend, was not one of peace or fulfillment, but of violence and death. The Greeks, despite their victories, found that their glory was overshadowed by the knowledge that war, no matter how victorious, left scars that could never be healed. For the Trojans, the fall of their city was just the beginning of their suffering. The destruction of Troy had come at a great cost, not just for the Greeks, but for the people of the city itself. Priam, the noble king of Troy, had been killed by Achilles' son Neoptolemus, and his kingdom had been reduced to rubble. The once proud city, with its towering walls and majestic palaces, was now a heap of ruins. The Trojans had lost everything: home, family, and future, and the gods had not come to their aid. The gods who had once been worshipped in Troy had turned their backs on the city, leaving its people to face the consequences of their defeat alone. The Trojan gods had been powerless in the face of the Greek onslaught, and now their followers were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. For Aeneas, the Trojan prince who had escaped the burning city, the fall of Troy was a moment of both loss and opportunity. Aeneas, unlike many of the other Trojan leaders, did not seek revenge. Instead, he sought survival, and the gods, particularly his mother, Aphrodite, ensured that he would live to see another day. Aeneas became the symbol of hope for the Trojans, the one who would carry their legacy forward. He was destined, according to prophecy, to found a new city, one that would become the Roman Empire. His journey, though fraught with obstacles and hardship, was a testament to the perseverance of the Trojan people. Aeneas' survival was not just a matter of fate, but a sign that the Trojans, though defeated, would never be forgotten. Their legacy would live on through his descendants, and their story would be passed down for generations to come. Yet, despite Aeneas' survival, the Trojans could not escape the harsh reality of their defeat. They were scattered, enslaved, or killed in the aftermath of the war, and the glory of their once great city was reduced to ashes. The Greeks, though they had destroyed Troy, found that their victory was a bitter one. The gods had ensured that there would be no peace for the victors, just as they had ensured that there would be no peace for the defeated. The story of Troy, though filled with triumphs and tragedies, was ultimately a reminder of the price of war. It was a tale of glory, but also one of suffering and loss, a story in which the gods were the final arbiters of fate. In the end, the Trojan War was not just a conflict between two cities, but a struggle between mortals and the divine. The gods, in their eternal wisdom, ensured that no one, neither the Greeks nor the Trojans, was free from the consequences of their actions. The Greeks, despite their victory, found themselves punished for their deceit. The Trojans, though defeated, were left with the legacy of their pride and their downfall. And through it all, the gods watched, ever present, ensuring that no victory was ever truly complete and that no defeat was ever final. The aftermath of the Trojan War marked the beginning of an era defined by a shifting understanding of heroism, divine retribution, and the inescapable consequences of human actions. Though the Greeks had celebrated their victory, the reality of their triumph was far from what they had imagined. The gods, who had intervened in every moment of the conflict, did not allow the victors to rest on their laurels. Their wrath was a constant reminder that no matter how great the victory, no mortal could escape the consequences of their choices. The Greeks, having brought Troy to its knees through trickery, now found themselves caught in the relentless grip of divine punishment. For the Greeks, the consequences of their actions became apparent in the years that followed the fall of Troy. Odysseus, perhaps the most famous of the Greek heroes, experienced firsthand the weight of divine retribution. His cleverness and cunning had been instrumental in the fall of Troy, but it was precisely this ingenuity that had drawn the ire of the gods. Poseidon, enraged by the blinding of his son Polyphemus, set in motion a series of trials that would torment Odysseus for years to come. What should have been a triumphant return home turned into a nightmarish journey that tested not only his physical strength, but also his moral character. Odysseus' journey home was marked by a series of encounters with divine beings, monsters, and natural disasters, each one a manifestation of the gods' anger. The stormy seas that Poseidon conjured were just the beginning. Along the way, Odysseus and his men faced the temptations of the sirens, whose enchanting songs threatened to lead them to their doom. They navigated the treacherous waters between the monstrous Scylla and the deadly whirlpool Charybdis. These were not just physical challenges. They were tests of Odysseus' resolve, his wisdom, and his understanding of fate. Each trial he faced was a reminder that no mortal could outwit the gods without paying the price. Despite his brilliance, Odysseus found himself unable to escape the wrath of the divine. His men, once loyal and strong, began to lose faith in him as they endured the hardships of the journey. Their trust in him faltered, and the realization began to set in that their return home would never be as simple as they had hoped. As the years wore on, the toll of the journey became more apparent. Odysseus' longing for home and family, his desire to return to Ithaca, became a burden that weighed him down with each passing day. The heroic figure, who had once been the epitome of Greek bravery, now found himself caught in a web of divine punishment that he could not escape. The gods, it seemed, were not content with simply punishing Odysseus. They ensured that his suffering would be long, drawn out, and filled with uncertainty. Each new challenge he faced was a direct consequence of the deception that had won the Greeks the war. The Trojan Horse, which had been the key to their victory, had also been the cause of their eventual downfall. Odysseus' success in the war, built on trickery and deceit, had earned him the enmity of the gods, and no amount of wisdom or courage could shield him from their judgment. Even as he sailed home, Odysseus faced a relentless onslaught of divine anger. For many of the other Greek heroes, the consequences of the Trojan War were no less severe. Menelaus, whose wife Helen had been the cause of the war, found no peace upon his return to Sparta, though he had fought to reclaim Helen. The emotional cost of the war was far greater than he had anticipated. The years of conflict had taken a toll on their relationship, and despite their reunion, there was no joy in it. Helen, whose beauty had ignited the war, was now a shadow of the woman Menelaus had once loved. The years of suffering, the loss of so many men, and the destruction of Troy had irreparably altered their bond. Menelaus' triumph, though a hard one, was tinged with sorrow and regret. The war had not only destroyed Troy, but had destroyed the very foundation of Menelaus' marriage, and no victory could make up for that loss. For Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, the consequences of his role in the Trojan War were even more tragic. Agamemnon, who had led the Greek forces with a sense of duty and pride, returned home only to find that his own wife, Clytemnestra, had plotted his murder. The reason for her revenge was rooted in the horrific sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia. In order to ensure the Greek fleet could sail to Troy, Agamemnon had agreed to sacrifice his own child to the gods. The gods, in their infinite power, had demanded the sacrifice, but the cost was unimaginable. Clytemnestra, consumed with grief and anger, had plotted her husband's death in his absence. When Agamemnon returned victorious, he was met with a fate more brutal than anything he had faced on the battlefield. His death at the hands of his wife was a stark reminder that no matter how great the hero, no one could escape the divine consequences of their actions. Even the mighty king of Mycenae could not outrun the wrath of the gods, and his death became a symbol of the cyclical nature of vengeance that would plague his family for generations to come. The fall of Troy, for all its triumphs and tragedies, left the Greek heroes in a state of profound disillusionment. The war, which had seemed to promise glory and honor, had instead brought pain, suffering, and betrayal. The gods, once the protectors and benefactors of the Greeks, had turned their backs on them, punishing them for their pride, their deception, and their bloodlust. The victorious soldiers who had returned home, whether to the ruins of their kingdoms or to remnants of their families, were forever marked by the price of war. They had destroyed Troy, but in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. The gods had ensured that no one, not even the greatest heroes, would be able to escape the consequences of their actions. The aftermath of the Trojan War also had profound effects on the Trojans, who had lost everything. The once proud city of Troy was now a pile of ruins, and its people were scattered across the known world. The great king Priam was dead, killed by the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, and the noble queen Hecuba was left to mourn the destruction of her city and her family. The women of Troy, once revered for their beauty and grace, were now taken as slaves by the Greeks. Their fate was a cruel reminder of the brutal realities of war, where even the most noble and virtuous could be reduced to pawns in a conflict that was beyond their control. The Trojans had lost their home, their families, and their future, and their suffering was compounded by the knowledge that their gods had not come to their aid. Yet, amid the ashes of Troy, there were those who survived, who carried on the legacy of their fallen city. Aeneas, the son of the Trojan prince Anchises, was one such survivor. Aeneas's journey, though filled with hardship and loss, was also a story of hope and resilience. Unlike many of the other Trojan leaders, Aeneas did not seek revenge against the Greeks. Instead, he focused on survival and the future of his people. Aeneas's destiny, as foretold by the gods, was to found a new city, one that would eventually become the Roman Empire. His journey was not just a personal struggle, but a continuation of the Trojan legacy. Aeneas's survival and eventual triumph were a testament to the endurance of the Trojan spirit. Though Troy had fallen, the story of its people was far from over. For Aeneas, the journey was not just a physical one, but a spiritual and emotional one. He was not only trying to establish a new home for the Trojans, but also grappling with the gods' will and the fate they had set for him. Aeneas's journey was marked by divine intervention, with gods and goddesses guiding, challenging, and testing him along the way. The gods who had once been protectors of Troy were now the agents of Aeneas's destiny, and their influence shaped the course of his journey. His survival, his eventual founding of Rome, and the legacy of Troy that he carried with him all spoke to the resilience of the Trojan people and the power of fate. Despite Aeneas's survival, the broader fate of the Trojans remained a tragic one. The city of Troy had been destroyed, and its people were scattered, enslaved, or killed. The Greeks had triumphed, but their victory had come at a great cost. The gods, in their eternal wisdom, had ensured that no victory, no matter how hard won, could ever be complete. The Trojan War had proven to be a conflict not just between two cities, but between mortals and the divine. It was a reminder that no one could escape the consequences of their actions, and that even the mightiest heroes were subject to the will of the gods. The story of Troy was not one of simple victory or defeat, but one of profound loss, divine retribution, and the unrelenting march of fate. The fall of Troy marked the end of an era, but the legacy of its people and their struggle would live on in the stories of the victors and the vanquished alike. The Trojan War, a conflict that spanned 10 long years, had come to its catastrophic end, but the repercussions of that war would stretch far beyond the walls of Troy. While the Greeks celebrated their victory, they could not escape the heavy burden of the gods' wrath. The gods, whose involvement in the war had been pivotal from the very beginning, did not allow the victors to return to their homes without a cost. The fall of Troy had been a triumph of cunning, strategy, and deception, but the price of that victory was steep. No one, not even the greatest of the Greek heroes, was free from the consequences of their actions. The gods, in their eternal wisdom, ensured that the aftermath of the war would be just as tumultuous as the war itself. For the Greek victors, the sense of accomplishment that came with the fall of Troy was fleeting, soon replaced by a gnawing unease. Their homes, once within reach, were now far more elusive than they had imagined. Odysseus, whose cunning had played a central role in the Greeks' victory, was perhaps the most affected. His role in the construction of the Trojan Horse, the very instrument of Troy's downfall, had earned him the admiration of his fellow Greeks, but the fury of the gods. Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose son Polyphemus had been blinded by Odysseus, was particularly vengeful. The Greek hero, who had long been praised for his intelligence and resourcefulness, now found himself ensnared by the gods' anger. His journey home, which should have been a joyful reunion with his family, instead turned into an agonizing years-long ordeal. For Odysseus, the journey back to Ithaca was not merely a return to his kingdom. It was a trial of endurance, wisdom, and humility. The gods, in their wrath, ensured that no matter how great his intellect or how cunning his strategies, Odysseus would not escape their judgment. Poseidon, furious at Odysseus' treatment of his son Polyphemus, conjured up endless storms, forcing the Greek hero to sail through dangerous and unfamiliar waters. Each time Odysseus, seemed on the brink of returning home, another trial would arise, further delaying his journey. The gods, it seemed, were determined to remind him that no victory, no matter how brilliant, came without consequence. The challenges that Odysseus faced were not merely physical, but also psychological. The temptation of the sirens, who lured sailors to their doom with their enchanting songs, was one such test. It was not only his men who had to resist their allure, but Odysseus himself. In order to protect his crew, he ordered them to block their ears with wax and had himself bound to the mast of the ship, so he could hear the music but could not act on the temptation. This moment highlighted the deep internal conflict that Odysseus grappled with throughout his journey. His desire to return home was so strong that even in the face of danger, he was willing to listen to the gods' calls for him to change course. But in doing so, he also showed his wisdom. The hero who had outsmarted the Trojans with his cunning now faced a test of restraint and foresight. In his heart, Odysseus was not just seeking to return home, but to prove to himself that he could master his own desires. Yet, it was not only Odysseus who faced the gods' wrath. Menelaus, whose wife Helen had sparked the war, found no peace upon his return to Sparta. Despite reclaiming his wife, his heart was not filled with the joy he had expected. The years of war, the deaths of countless men, and the destruction of Troy had left an indelible mark on him. Helen, once the cause of all the suffering, was now by his side, but their relationship had been irreparably damaged by the war. The love that had once seemed so pure was now a shadow of its former self. The peace that Menelaus had longed for was elusive, as he realized that the true cost of the war could never be undone. Even after all the bloodshed and sacrifice, his homecoming was fraught with sorrow. He had won back his wife, but at what cost? The gods had ensured that Menelaus' victory would never be complete. The peace he had fought for was forever tarnished by the emotional and psychological toll of the war. Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces, had an even more tragic fate awaiting him. His return to Mycenae, which should have been a celebration of his victory, was instead marked by death at the hands of his wife, Clytemnestra. The cause of this was rooted in Agamemnon's own sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia, to ensure favorable winds for the Greek fleet. This decision, which Agamemnon had made in the name of duty, was one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Clytemnestra, filled with grief and anger, could not forgive her husband for his actions, and upon his return, she murdered him in his own home. Agamemnon, who had been a proud and powerful leader, met his end at the hands of the woman he had loved and trusted. His death was a grim reminder of the cyclical nature of violence and retribution. The gods, who had demanded the sacrifice of Iphigenia, had not spared Agamemnon from their judgment. His family, once great and proud, was now torn apart by betrayal and bloodshed. Agamemnon's death was just the beginning of a tragic series of events that would continue to plague his family for generations. The gods had ensured that no hero, no matter how mighty, could escape the consequences of their actions. While the Greek heroes struggled with the fallout from their victory, the Trojans, whose city had been destroyed, faced a different kind of devastation. The fall of Troy was a cataclysmic event, and for its people, it marked the end of an era. The once proud city, with its towering walls and magnificent palaces, was now reduced to ruins. The noble King Priam, who had led his people with dignity and honor, was killed by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. Priam's death, along with the slaughter of his family, symbolized the utter destruction of Troy. The women of Troy, including the noble queen Hecuba, were taken as slaves by the Greeks, and the once thriving city was left in ashes. However, not all Trojans were doomed to perish with their city. Aeneas, the son of the Trojan prince Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite, was one of the few who survived the destruction of Troy. Aeneas's escape from the burning city marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Trojans. Aeneas, unlike many of the other leaders of Troy, did not seek revenge on the Greeks. Instead, he focused on survival, determined to find a new home for the surviving Trojans. Guided by the will of the gods, Aeneas set out on a journey that would take him across the Mediterranean and eventually lead to the founding of a new city, which would later become Rome. Aeneas's journey was one of hardship and perseverance. It was a tale of resilience in the face of insurmountable odds. Though he had lost everything, his home, his family, his city, Aeneas never lost sight of his purpose. His survival was not just an act of chance, but a testament to the strength of the Trojan spirit. The gods, who had abandoned Troy, now turned their favor to Aeneas, guiding him on his journey to create a new home for his people. Aeneas's journey was fraught with challenges, but it was also marked by divine intervention. The gods, who had once been protectors of Troy, now shaped Aeneas's destiny, ensuring that he would carry the Trojan legacy forward. Aeneas's survival and eventual triumph were a symbol of hope for the Trojans, a sign that despite their destruction, they would live on through him. As Aeneas sailed from one land to the next, he encountered both allies and enemies, but his resolve never wavered. His journey took him to the shores of Italy, where he eventually founded the city of Lavinium, the first step in the creation of what would eventually become the Roman Empire. Aeneas's story, though filled with loss and suffering, was ultimately one of redemption. His survival and the establishment of a new city were fulfillment of the prophecy that had guided him from the very beginning. Through Aeneas, the Trojans would live on, their legacy carried by the Romans who would descend from him. The story of Troy, though it ended in tragedy, would continue to echo through history, for the Trojans' descendants would go on to create one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. While Aeneas represented the survival of Troy's legacy, the Greeks, despite their victory, found no peace. Their triumph had come at a terrible cost, and the gods made sure that their suffering would not end with the fall of Troy. The gods' anger, which had been provoked by the Greeks' deceit and bloodshed, lingered long after the war was over. The heroes of the Trojan War, though they had fought valiantly, found themselves trapped in a cycle of punishment that seemed inescapable. The gods, ever vigilant, ensured that no victory was ever truly complete, and no hero could ever escape the consequences of their actions. The aftermath of the Trojan War was a reminder that war, no matter how justified, always carries with it an immense cost. The Greeks had won. The consequences of the Trojan War continued to ripple through both the Greek and Trojan civilizations, long after the final battle had been fought and the city of Troy lay in ruins. The Greek victors, who had once celebrated their triumph, found themselves ensnared by the complex web of divine retribution. No matter how mighty or heroic their feats, the gods made sure that no victory, no matter how seemingly justifiable, came without a heavy price. While the Trojans had suffered the loss of their city, their families, and their gods, the Greeks were now paying for the deceitful, cunning means through which they had secured their triumph. The Greeks had used the Trojan Horse, a symbol of deception, betrayal, and cleverness, to infiltrate Troy and deliver the fatal blow. But what had been perceived as a brilliant tactic was ultimately the very reason for their suffering. The gods, particularly Poseidon and Athena, whose power had shaped the events of the war, were deeply offended by the Greeks' dishonorable methods. They had not won the war through valor or bravery alone, but through a deceptive act that contradicted the noble ideals that had once been the foundation of Greek heroism. The gods were not content to let the Greeks rest easy on their laurels, and so they began to exact their revenge. For Odysseus, the mastermind behind the Trojan Horse, the divine consequences were particularly severe. The man who had outwitted the Trojans with his cunning now found himself at the mercy of the gods. Poseidon, whose son Polyphemus had been blinded by Odysseus, took it as a personal affront. The god of the sea swore vengeance on the hero, and Odysseus' journey home became a prolonged and harrowing ordeal. Though Odysseus was known for his resourcefulness and wit, the gods ensured that no amount of cleverness would allow him to avoid the consequences of his actions. The storms that Poseidon sent, the monsters that he encountered, and the trials that he faced all served to remind him that even the greatest heroes could not outwit divine judgment. Odysseus' long and arduous journey home, which should have been a triumphant return, became a trial of endurance, wisdom, and humility. The trials he faced, including the deadly allure of the Sirens, the treacherous waters between Scylla and Charybdis, and the encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus, were all manifestations of the gods' anger. Odysseus' journey was not just a physical challenge, but a test of his character and resolve. Each obstacle he faced was a reminder that, though he was a great hero, he was still subject to the will of the gods. His cleverness, which had once been the key to his success, now only brought him suffering, as the gods continually sought to humble him. While Odysseus faced divine wrath, Menelaus, the king of Sparta and the man who had fought to reclaim his wife Helen, found his own homecoming marred by the lingering effects of the Trojan War. Menelaus's victory in reclaiming Helen, whose abduction had been the cause of the war, seemed hollow in the face of the destruction and death that had been caused by the conflict. His joy at Helen's return was overshadowed by the knowledge of all that had been lost. The once proud heroes who had fought in the war now returned to find that their triumph had come at the cost of their peace and happiness. Menelaus had won back his wife, but the emotional toll of the war was more than he could bear. The relationship between him and Helen, once filled with love and devotion, had been irreparably damaged. The gods had ensured that even the victors of the war would find no respite. The emotional devastation left in the wake of the war could not be undone, and Menelaus's homecoming, though outwardly successful, was ultimately one of regret and sorrow. For Agamemnon, the king who had led the Greek forces, the aftermath of the war was even more tragic. His sacrifice of his daughter, Iphigenia, in order to secure favorable winds for the Greek fleet, had already set the stage for his eventual downfall. The gods had demanded the sacrifice, but in doing so, Agamemnon had angered his wife, Clytemnestra. While Agamemnon was away fighting in Troy, Clytemnestra's grief and rage festered, and she plotted her revenge. When Agamemnon finally returned home, victorious but weary, he was met not with celebration, but with murder at the hands of his wife. Clytemnestra's act of vengeance, though fueled by deep emotional pain, was also a sign that no hero, no matter how mighty, could escape the consequences of their actions. Agamemnon, who had led the Greeks to victory, found that the cost of that victory was his own life. His death marked the beginning of a cycle of bloodshed and betrayal within his family, one that would continue to haunt them for generations. The gods, in their wisdom, had ensured that Agamemnon's glory was short-lived, for his actions had irreparably shattered the foundation of his family. While the Greeks struggled with the fallout from the war, the Trojans, whose once great city had been reduced to rubble, faced an even more devastating reality. The destruction of Troy was not just the end of a war. It was the end of a way of life. The city, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of wealth, power, and culture, was now a heap of ruins. Priam, the noble king of Troy, had been killed, and his family had been scattered or slaughtered. The Trojans had lost everything: home, family, and future. Their gods, once their protectors, had abandoned them in their time of need, leaving them to suffer in the wake of the Greek conquest. The survivors of Troy, including the noble queen Hecuba, were taken as slaves, their lives now in the hands of their conquerors.